The 80s were a hell of a time for wrestling. The business was booming and expanding globally. With so many moving parts and constant changes through the decade, it can be hard to pinpoint and identify exactly who ruled this decade. In this video, we will try to do our best to rank the top 100 wrestlers of the 1980s. We turn to you, our loyal subscribers, for feedback, as well as created our own weighted criteria system. As always, this is opinion and entertainment. Without wasting any more time, let's get into it. Number 100, Lanny Poffo. Leaping Lanny Poffo started the 1980s in his father's ICW promotion, but made quick stops in Mid-South and Continental before settling into the WWF in 1985. Most of us were none the wiser that he was the brother of the Macho Man. Number 99, Sam Houston. Houston began his career in 1983 in Florida before moving on to Mid-Atlantic, then the Central States, before a brief stint in the UWF, and by 1987, Houston found his way to the WWF, where he spent the rest of the decade. Number 98, Baron Von Raschke. The Baron spent his most notable time in the 80s as a tag team champion in the AWA. He then moved on to a non-wrestling role in the WWF to wrap up his 80s wrestling career. He makes it into the list based off of being a long-time tag team champion. Number 97, Hillbilly Jim. Hillbilly Jim spent the first few years of the 80s in Stampede Wrestling and the CWA. He was known there as Harley Davidson before ending up in the WWF in 1984 as Big Jim. He then transitioned into Hillbilly Jim, which is who he would be for the rest of the 80s. He was one of the most over baby faces of the WWF product during the decade. Number 96, Big John Studd. What would you say if I told you that Andre the Giant's biggest rival in the 80s was not Hulk Hogan, but in fact it was Big John Studd? Studd feuded with Andre for almost his entire WWF stint in one way or another, and although Studd briefly retired for 2 years in the middle of the 80s, he returned to the WWF to close the decade by winning the 1989 Royal Rumble. Number 95, Steve Armstrong. One of Bullet Bob Armstrong's many wrestling children, Steve started wrestling in 1983 for Southeast Championship Wrestling before departing for Florida. During this time, he was locked in a tag team with Tracy Smothers. They were originally the Wild-Eyed Southern Boys and then switched that to just the Southern Boys. Steve and Tracy finished out the decade with a pretty impressive tour of New Japan. Number 94, Dutch Mantell. Dirty Dutch Mantell traveled across many territories in the 80s, but is probably most known for his work in Memphis with Jerry Lawler. Also appeared regularly on high-profile NWA television. His in-ring career wrapped up as the decades did, but was always considered a great hand, a great mind for the wrestling business. Number 93, The Grappler. Grappler started the decade in Mid-South before moving on to Mid-Atlantic, Texas, Japan. The man basically worked everywhere, then ended the decade in the Pacific Northwest. A solid hand for years and a very underrated legend of the business. Number 92, Jim Duggan. Hacksaw Jim Duggan's career in the early 80s was basically a sandwich. The meat was his time in Mid-South, sandwiched between two healthy loaves of Japanese tours. By 1987, Duggan had landed in the WWF, where his most famous work would occur, beloved by the fans for his innocently tough demeanor and of course for being a blue-collar man carrying a 2x4. Number 91, Jesse Barr. Son of legendary Portland wrestling promoter Sandy Barr, Jesse Barr spent the start of the 80s in Florida, where he stayed quite busy till the WWF brought him in around 1985 to be Jimmy Jack Funk, an estranged relative of Terry and Dory Funk. While that was about as amazing as it sounds, nevertheless kicked around in the WWF through the rest of the decade. Number 90, George the Animal Steele. George Steele was brought into wrestling straight into the WWF when it still had the third W. By the 1980s, he was still there, and it's pretty much around this time he developed the animal gimmick. Steele was a staple of 80s WWF television, and by far one of the company's most recognizable stars of the decade. Number 89, Crusher Khrushchev / Smash. This man, Barry Darsow, adopted the persona of Crusher Viktor Khrushchev, a Russian man from Minnesota. Some of his most notable work was from his time in NWA as a part of the Russian wrestling stable, but by 1987, Darsow found his way to the WWF to do perhaps his most legendary work as Smash of the Demolition. Number 88, Shawn Michaels. The showstopper had to start somewhere. From humble beginnings to tag team stardom in the AWA with Marty Jannetty, the 80s were the true formative years of the showstopper. Number 87, Butch Reed. The 80s were kind to Butch Reed as he rolled into the decade by storming the territories of St. Louis, Florida, and Georgia. Then he would venture to Mid-South for a cup of coffee before heading out to the WWF, where he dyed his hair blonde to be the natural Butch Reed. Get it? Reed would close out the decade by joining up with Jim Crockett Promotions. Number 86, Hector Guerrero. While his most notable work was in Mexico, Hector was used as basically a really good enhancement guy for the territories and the WWF, closing out the decade with a good run in the AWA. However, it was the late 80s dying AWA. Number 85, Jerry Briscoe. With his brother Jack, they were a stronghold in the Mid-Atlantic and in Georgia before landing in the WWF in 1984, where Jerry specifically continued his career into his retirement in 2020. Number 84, Don Morocco. Working through the territories, Morocco first appeared for the WWF in 1981. That's where he would become a mainstay and a name. He would finish up the 80s by working in Stampede Wrestling and a brief stint with All Japan. While in the WWF, Morocco held the WWF Intercontinental Championship twice. Number 83, Jimmy Valiant. Having debuted in 1964, by the 1980s, Valiant found himself as a mainstay of Jim Crockett Promotions, as that's where he spent the majority of the decade before returning to Memphis at the end of it. In 1982, Valiant spent 260 days as the NWA television champion. Number 82, Stan Lane. After debuting in Florida in 1978, by the early 80s, Stan Lane started appearing in Memphis with Steve Kern as the Fabulous Ones. From there, they would take the act to the AWA for a couple years before splitting. Then Lane joined Jim Crockett Promotions to be the new member of the Midnight Express, and that's how Mr. Lane finished the decade of the 1980s. Number 81, Greg Gagne, son of Vern Gagne, and before you ridicule his spot here, just know that he was AWA Tag Team Champion with Jim Brunzell for over 1,000 days. So that's something right there. A second-generation guy who did okay despite the bar being very unrealistically highly set. Number 80, Jack Briscoe, the other half of the Briscoe Brothers tag team and legendary Briscoe Brothers body shop. Pretty much everything we said about Jerry, we can say for Jack here. Number 79, Marty Jannetty. Jannetty began his career in Mid-South before moving on to the Central States Wrestling Territory, and that's where Jannetty would form the Midnight Rockers with Shawn Michaels. The duo would then storm through the AWA and close the decade working for the WWF. Number 78, Tony Atlas. Born Anthony White, Tony Atlas began wrestling in 1974, and by the time the 80s rolled around, he was firmly employed by the WWF, where he spent the early part of the decade until departing and landing in the AWA. After being there a bit, he returned to the WWF for another brief run. Atlas would then close the decade bouncing around for places like Puerto Rico, Texas, and ICW, just to name a few. Number 77, superstar Billy Graham. While he enjoyed great success in the 1970s, the 80s were a mixed bag for the superstar. Spent a lot of time either injured or wrestling partially injured. He still managed to stay a star and a name throughout the entire decade, but as the 80s closed, it was all over for him. Number 76, Billy Jack Haynes. Billy Jack began his wrestling journey in 1982 in Stu Hart's dungeon. After that, he was let loose into Stampede Wrestling to further his pursuit. Haynes would then venture out and do stints in Florida and Portland before landing in the WWF in 1986. The WWF run lasted until 1988. From there, his career was never the same. He retreated to the Portland area, and several legends surround his persona. Just recently was taken into custody for being suspected of of murdering his wife. Number 75, Dennis Condrey. Memphis, Georgia, NWA, Mid-Atlantic, you name it. Dennis Condrey worked there. Most famously known as half of the Midnight Express. The amazing stat on Condrey is that during the decade of the 80s, he had a total of 29 championship wins. And while most of those were tag team titles, there are some singles titles mixed in there as well. Number 74, Buzz Sawyer. Sawyer started wrestling in 1978, and when the 80s began, he was mainly wrestling for Jim Crockett Promotions with some stints in Georgia. In 1984, he found himself in the WWF for a brief showing before landing down in Florida as one of Kevin Sullivan's Freak Show. In 1986, Sawyer won the World Class Tag titles with Matt Bourne, and they kept them for almost an entire year. Number 73, Bobby Fulton. Fulton began wrestling in 1977 at just 16 years old, and by the 1980s, he was in Stampede Wrestling before moving on to Continental. But it was his stop after that in Mid-South Wrestling where he met up with Tommy Rogers and formed the Fantastics, and for whatever reason, the team clicked. The duo would stay together for the rest of the decade and then some. Number 72, The Great Kabuki. After assuming many other aliases, by 1981, Akihisa Mira had adopted the persona of the Great Kabuki in World Class Championship Wrestling. Kabuki was a world-class staple through the decade, although he did make sporadic appearances for other promotions. Great Kabuki one time spent 438 days as the world-class Brass Knuckles champion. Number 71, Jim Neidhart. The Anvil began wrestling in 1978 for Stampede Wrestling, and that would continue all the way until 1985. And although Stampede was Neidhart's home base, he would make global appearances during the decade as well, and would also appear in Mid-South and Georgia. In 1985, when Stampede was sold to Vince McMahon, Anvil and some guy named Bret Hart were included in the deal. Number 70, Dick Slater. A 12-year veteran by the time the 80s came around, he began the decade in Georgia before moving to Mid-Atlantic and then to Mid-South. Slater would then have a cup of coffee in the WWF before closing out the decade in Japan. Number 69, Buddy Rose. Rose began the decade in the Portland territory before moving to the WWF in 1982. However, he would yo-yo back and forth to Portland, back to the WWF, and back again. Buddy then returned to the AWA where he had worked in the 70s. After doing that for a bit, he ended up back in Portland again to close out the decade. Buddy Rose and his tag team partner Doug Summers spent 255 days as the AWA Tag Team Champions. Number 68, David Schultz. Schultz began his career in 1974, and when the 80s started, he was in an obscure promotion called Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling before moving on to Stampede. Schultz then landed in the AWA in 1983, but then quickly jumped to the WWF, where he'd famously go off and attack reporter John Stossel. Career was never the same again. Number 67, Bad News Allen. Alan Codes was born in 1943 and began wrestling in 1977. Allen started the decade working for Vince Sr., but in 1982 found himself in Stampede Wrestling, where he spent the majority of the decade before departing for the WWF in 1988. While he was there, he went from Bad News Allen to Bad News Brown. Number 66, Jesse the Body Ventura. Ventura began the decade in the AWA, where he continued to develop his persona, which became so over the top it gained the attention of Vince McMahon and the WWF, who then convinced him to make the move over to Stamford. His in-ring career wrapped up in the middle of the decade, but went on to be a prolific color commentator to close out the 80s. Number 65, Ivan Koloff. Koloff spent his decade of the 80s touring the NWA territories, to much success and title reigns, including 4 NWA World Tag Team title reigns. Number 64, Dino Bravo. Bravo came up through the Canadian wrestling scene, specifically a company called International Wrestling in the 1970s, and that would continue into the decade of the 80s before he gained the attention of the WWF. He would spend the rest of the decade there. An impressive stat of the day, Dino Bravo and his 2 separate year-plus reigns with the International Heavyweight Championship. Championship. Number 63, Ray Stevens. Ray Stevens is regarded as an all-timer. However, in the 80s, he was in the twilight of his career, but despite that, he had memorable runs with the WWF and the AWA during that decade. Stevens' title reigns in the decade were few, but did feature a 158-day reign with the NWA World Tag Team titles with none other than Jimmy Snuka. Number 62, Rocky Johnson. Johnson's run was most notable for his time in the WWF from 1982 to around 1985. From there, he really put on the miles, traveling through many territories. Johnson and Atlas were tag team champions for a total of 158 days. Number 61, Terry Taylor. Taylor was a true nomad of the 80s wrestling scene. He started the decade bouncing around NWA territories and then spent the mid-80s in the Mid-South, then the UWF, Jim Crockett, and even World Class before showing up in the WWF in 1988, where he would eventually be rebranded the embarrassing Red Rooster. Number 60, Austin Idol. Idol was an 8-year veteran by the time the hair decade rolled around. Memphis, Georgia, Texas, Japan, you name it, Austin Idol worked there in the 1980s. Random title stat is that Austin Idol spent 203 days as the AWA International Champion. Number 59, the Honky Tonk Man. The cousin of Jerry the King Lawler, spent 4 years of his time in the 80s with Stampede Wrestling before making his way over to the WWF. And the WWF, Honky had a legendary run with the Intercontinental Championship and set a record that stood for over 30 years. Number 58, Bruno Sammartino. Much like Ray Stevens, the 80s for Bruno Sammartino was very much the end of days. Used sparingly and with exactly 0 title wins during the decade, at this point, Bruno was pretty much an attraction-type wrestler. Number 57, Bob Orton. An 8-year vet by the time the 80s started, Orton was a hand for the NWA and had a brief stint in the middle of that with the WWF, but wouldn't begin there fully until 1984, where Orton is famous for being in the corner of Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff for the very first WrestleMania. Number 56, Jerry Blackwell. Blackwell was a staple of the AWA through the entire decade, sans some very brief tenures, including being the NWA Missouri Heavyweight Champion for a total of 259 days. Number 55, Steve Keirn. Keirn was a mainstay of the territories in the 1980s and is famous for being half of the Fabulous Ones tag team. Also, he and Mike Graham spent almost a year as the NWA Florida Tag Team Champions. Number 54, Nikolai Volkov. Volkov was a 13-year veteran by the time the 80s rolled around, and while he started the decade doing work for the AWA, he finished it working for the WWF, including a forever career highlight of winning the tag team titles at the very first WrestleMania with his partner, the Iron Sheik. Number 53, Kevin Sullivan. The future Taskmaster spent most of his decade holding it down with Florida Championship Wrestling. From there, he caught the eye of Jim Crockett Promotions, where he essentially finished the decade. Sullivan won the NWA Florida Southern Championship 7 times during the 80s. Number 52, Eddie Gilbert. Gilbert started the decade by winning the AWA Southern Tag Team titles with his father, Tommy Gilbert. In 1982, he started working WWF rings, grinding his way from an enhancement talent, but by the time he left 2 years later, he was in the mid-cards. Seeking more, Gilbert departed and went to Continental, then on to the UWF, then back to Continental, before ending the decade with Jim Crockett. Number 51, Robert Gibson. When Robert Gibson started the decade, he was all on his own. Then in 1983, he found his life tag team partner in Ricky Morton. Tag team wrestling was never the same since. The duo blazed a trail through the territories that you can say still lasts to this day. Number 50, Sting. Sting began his career in 1985 in the CWA, but by the time the decade closed, he was arguably Jim Crockett's biggest star. While his 5-year resume is pretty impressive, all in all, he was still very raw, and also goes to show how stacked up the competition was at the time. Number 49, Bobby Eaton. Eaton started his journey in 1976, and by 1980, he was working for Continental. He then did some small stints in the Mid-South and World Class before landing in Crockett Land, where he would do his most notable work while ending the decade. Number 48, Arn Anderson. Arn debuted in 1982 for Mid-South, and during his first few years also did work in Tennessee and Alabama. In 1984, Arn started working for Jim Crockett, and the rest was history. That's where he spent most of the decade as a member of the Four Horsemen. Arn departed for the WWF for a brief time in 1989. Number 47, Ricky Morton. Morton started wrestling in 1977, then in 1983 found his tag team partner Robert Gibson, and as the Rock and Roll Express, they tore up the 80s tag team wrestling scene. Number 46, Chief Wahoo McDaniel. Wahoo was in the twilight of his career during this decade, but he still gets the top 50 treatment here due to his drawing power and also a not too shabby run with the NWA US title in 1985. Number 45, Nikita Koloff. Koloff debuted in 1984. Unlike Sting, Koloff had the advantage of being pretty much directly drafted into Jim Crockett Promotions. In just a few short years, he found himself at the top of the cards, although by the time the decade closed, he found himself working with the struggling AWA, with retirement not too far off in the distance. Number 44, Ole Anderson. Ole Anderson was seemingly born a grizzled veteran. He spent the 80s between Crockett and Georgia, also just, helped form the Four Horsemen. No big deal. And in 1985 through 1986, he and Arn Anderson spent nearly a calendar year as the NWA Tag Team Champions. Number 43, King Kong Bundy. Solid big man, headlined WrestleMania 2. The 80s were pretty kind to Bundy overall, I'd say. His menacing presence really helped etch in the minds of WWF fans during the decade. Number 42, David Von Erich. David began wrestling in 1977, and by the time the 80s were birthed, really started catching momentum. In 1984, he was at the top of his game when he died during a tour of Japan. The official cause was stomach issues. There are other theories out there that state other factors. Either way, David's time was cut tragically short. Number 41, Kevin Von Erich. David was actually probably considered the better worker, but due to his tragedy, Kevin got to be in the ring for a lot longer resume, and that simply gives him just the slightest edge here. Kevin was a great worker in his own right, but David was him, if you know what I mean. Number 40, Michael P.S. Hayes. Starting the decade in places like Mid-South and Georgia, Hayes and his band of Freebirds did the most damage in the world-class territory, starting around 1982 and running all the way till around 1986. From there, he took his talents to the NWA for a bit before returning to world class. As cool as all the Freebird title wins were, I'm sure, Hayes really enjoyed his 15-day run with the NWA United States Championship. Number 39, Ted DiBiase. DiBiase worked his tail off all the way throughout the 80s to finally reach the pinnacle, which would probably be considered his run as the $1 Million Man, and more specifically, the feud with Hulk Hogan that surrounded WrestleMania 4, in which was the direct cause for him being a WWF champion, even if it was for a millisecond on a technicality when Andre the Giant just tried to give him the championship. Number 38, Bret Hart. Bret Hart was, of course, a product of the Dungeon and Stampede Wrestling, and in mid-decade, he found himself in the WWF. While starting in the tag team ranks with his partner Jim Neidhart, bigger things were always earmarked for the future hitman. Number 37, Jimmy Garvin. Garvin had 13 different title runs in the 1980s. He also toured various promotions years and was a successful solo act, and then part of the rebranding of the Fabulous Freebirds later in the decade. In the scheme of things, I believe him to be very underrated as a whole. Number 36, Greg Valentine. With 10 years already under his belt, Valentine started the decades in Mid-Atlantic. He then gave the WWF a try for a bit before returning, but then ultimately deciding, you know what, I'm going back to the WWF, and that's where Valentine would stay for the rest of the decade. While championship accomplishments were fleeting, I dare you to find a more solid overall hand than Greg Valentine. Number 35, Tommy Rich. The world was Tommy Rich's at one point in the early 80s. People say that he kind of flamed out with his star, or maybe burned the candle at both ends. He reclaimed some of his glory later in the decade, but his time had literally passed. Number 34, Paul Orndorff. Orndorff is most noted for headlining the first WrestleMania with his partner Roddy Piper. In a parallel universe, perhaps Orndorff is another Hulk Hogan, or at the very least, the other Ultimate Warrior. But time and circumstance just never allowed for those things to happen. Number 33, Iceman Parsons. A former world-class heavyweight champion, a world champion that gets lost in the fray and many discussions, arguably just as important to the Freebird Von Erich feud as anyone, and it shows that he was rewarded with his world title opportunity while it may not have lasted long. Number 32, Magnum TA. Magnum was for a moment a Southern Hulk Hogan, or even better yet, he was a mulleted Jesus Christ, because many wrestling fans thought he walked on water. A guy with the look and charisma of a movie star, could actually wrestle very well. A motorcycle crash claimed his career, but not his life, thankfully. Many wonder what could have been. Number 31, the Iron Sheik. While synonymous with the WWF, the Sheik began the 80s there, but then ventured out into Jim Crockett, Mid-South, Florida, and Georgia before finally arriving back in the WWF just in time to win the championship, albeit lose it in short order to Hulk Hogan. Many believe Sheik's last words were Hulk Hogan is a jabroni. Number 30, Carlos Colon. The man who owned Puerto Rico for the whole decade of the 80s. Too many title reigns there that I lost count. Number 29, Gino Hernandez. Hernandez began wrestling in 1977 in the Texas area, so as the 80s began, he was involved with World Class. He then departed for Mid-South in 1982, then returned to Texas by 1984, where he was already such a bigger established star. Sadly though, in 1986, he was found dead of an apparent cocaine overdose, although some that knew him are still skeptical of that to this day. Number 28, Tully Blanchard. A part of the original Four Horsemen, many thought Tully would be the next big main event draw coming through the Crockett system in the 80s. That never really seemed to pan out though, and he and Arn Anderson split for the WWF, but then a failed drug test derailed everything altogether. Number 27, Chris Adams. Known as the Gentleman, an English import traveled about for the first 4 years of the 80s before finally landing in World Class. It was there that Adams became a household name as one of the most despised heels in that particular territory. Adams was beyond talented in the ring. Personal demons are said to be the cause of his ascension in the business, being nothing but arrested development. Number 26, the Junkyard Dog. If you just remember his WWF run, you probably think of JYD as a mid-carder, but truth be told, virtually anywhere else, he was the bee's knees big deal. Big man on campus, basically insanely over anywhere that he went. In 1983 and 84, he spent 138 days as the Mid-South North American champion. Number 25, Ronnie Garvin. Better known as Rugged Ronnie Garvin, the man was an 18-year veteran by the time the ball dropped into 1980. Garvin spent 234 days as the NWA National Heavyweight Champion in 84-85. Number 24, Terry Gordy. Gordy began wrestling in 1974 at just the age of 13. In 1980, he found himself in the Georgia territory with the Freebirds by his side. As mentioned, the group jumped to World Class around 82, and that's where Gordy quickly finished his work in the decade for the most part, besides a few cups of coffee in other places, mainly the WWF and UWF. Gordy's career was cut tragically short in the early 90s, but he still had the most amazing decade in the 80s. Number 23, the Dynamite Kid. Many would say hands down the best wrestler of all time, and there's an argument to be made there for sure for how amazing Dynamite was from bell to bell. He never received the recognition in America until way after his time had already passed. Many know him for his run with Davey Boy Smith as the British Bulldogs. There was so much more than that. Number 22, Barry Windham, son of Blackjack Mulligan. Windham had a pedigree when he debuted in 1979. It was no overnight success for him though, as he kind of mimed through the Florida territory before having a run up in the WWF. It was his return to the NWA and Crockett in 1986 where Windham really began to catch fire, and he ended the decade at the absolute top of his game. Number 21, Jimmy Snuka. History and time have exposed Snuka as a cold-as-ice murderer. However, from his work in the 1980s, it would be very hard to omit him completely from this list. He sits outside the top 20 here, though. Number 20, Bruiser Brody. Bruiser Brody was quite simply awesome. Brody was the international heavyweight champion of the NWA for 497 days straight at one point. While most of his best work was done overseas, the work I believe is still significant enough, and being such a huge influence on everyone, it would be a crime to have a list of top 80s wrestlers that did not include him. Number 19, Jake Roberts. Roberts is of course the most famous for his WWF run as Jake the Snake, but his territory work that he did, like many, that's what got him there. The methodical style that he developed was certainly unique, and Jake was arguably one of the biggest WWF stars of the 80s to never be a world champion. Number 18, Terry Funk. Many believe the 80s were the tail end of the career of Terry Funk. He would continue to wrestle for another 15 years after that. Regardless, he did some of his best work in the decade, most notably his feud with Ric Flair for the NWA title in the late 1980s. Number 17, Roddy Piper. Piper was an 11-year vet by the turn into the 80s. During that time, he was a West Coast superstar, mainly representing the Oregon and California promotions. Then he ventured on to Georgia and Mid-Atlantic before settling into the WWF in 1984. With the help of his show, Piper's Pit, he quickly became a top villain in the company on his way to headlining the first ever WrestleMania. Piper was perhaps the WWF's biggest heel of the entire decade. Number 16, Rick Martel. Martel started the decade in the WWF as a tag team guy. He signed over to the AWA, and they in turn invested a ton into him by making him the AWA champion for a whole 19-month reign. Things were on their way down in the AWA, and soon after losing the title, Martel departed back for the WWF, where he would finish out the decade. Number 15, Kurt Hennig. Speaking of the AWA, here we have another AWA champion, albeit in the dying days. Here is Kurt Hennig, second-generation wrestler, also had some brief stints with the WWF and Portland Wrestling, but his mainstay home in the 80s was the AWA, as he was there pretty much until it folded. Number 14, Stan Hansen. His most famous American work in the 80s was for the AWA, albeit it was a brief amount of time. He also worked for the WWF and for the NWA at the tail end of the decade. The man brought back many titles from overseas. Number 13, Larry Zbyszko. Protege of Bruno Sammartino, Zbyszko had the mindset from day one that he was going to make it. He started the decade in the WWF, but quickly left in 1981 to do a small stint in Georgia before landing in Vern Gagne's AWA. Zbyszko left for Crockett in 87, but returned to the AWA in 1989, just in time to become the promotion's final world champion. Number 12, Rick Rude. Rude began wrestling in 82. His first TV match was for Mid-Atlantic, but he also made early runs with All-Star Wrestling, Georgia, and Continental. And in 1985, he ventured to World Class, then on to Crockett, and wouldn't you know it, by 87 found himself in the WWF. Rude was the champion of World Class for 134 days in 1986. Number 11, Kerry Von Erich, the most revered of the generation of Von Erichs. It's hard to argue that from a physical standpoint, he looks literally chiseled out of stone. Of course, he was a mainstay of his father's promotion, World Class, although he also did spots and co-promotions all over the country, and by the end of the decade, the highs of World Class was over, and soon a final tragedy for Kerry and the Von Erichs. Number 10, Ricky Steamboat. Steamboat began wrestling in 1976, and when the 80s commenced, he was a mainstay of Mid-Atlantic and started the decade with a pair of Mid-Atlantic title wins. But in 1985, he ventured into the WWF as Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, a key player leading up to his all-timer with Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3. And by the end of the decade, though it was time for him to venture back into the NWA in chase of even more success. Number 9, Jerry Lawler, the king of the Memphis territory. The man owned the town. This was leveraged with other promotions at times like the AWA and World Class, but for the most part, Lawler was a Memphis guy through and through, held more titles there than there even are legal or countable. Number 8, Nick Bockwinkel. Bockwinkel was a 26-year veteran by the time the 1980s rolled around. Despite his age, he spent a cumulative of over 2,500 days as the AWA heavyweight champion. Inside the decade, not exactly a lightweight. His work represented the guard of a different time, and some would argue that he was one of the last of his kind. Number 7, Bob Backlund. Backlund entered the 80s as a WWF mainstay and was even half of the tag team champions with Pedro Morales. In 1983, Backlund became the WWF champion and had a very lengthy reign, then lost the title to Iron Sheik in controversial fashion. At a time, though, Backlund was perhaps the most sound wrestler there was out there. Number 6, Andre the Giant. What can you say about Andre that hasn't been said already? Andre was and simply is the most iconic big man there has ever been in wrestling, highlighted by the huge performance at WrestleMania 3, but sadly those proved to be some of his last decent days. Life of a Giant definitely takes its toll. Number 5, Randy Savage. Starting in the 80s in his father's ICW, which would eventually merge with Memphis, his work during this time would garner the attention of the WWF, where he landed in 1985, and in less than 2 years, he was putting on an absolute clinic with Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania 3, and for an encore, won the WWF Championship at WrestleMania 4, then defended that title at Mania 5 against Hulk Hogan. Quite a run and quite the decade for the Macho Man. Number 4, Harley Race. 21-year vet by the time he made it into the 80s, Harley was a staple of the NWA territory system. Not just a staple, but one of the major players. Harley gave everything he had to the business and then some. In 1986, he finally headed up north to the WWF, where he became King Harley Race. From bell to bell in the 80s, even at an advanced age, hard to find a better one than Harley Race. Number 3, Dusty Rhodes. Florida, Georgia, Mid-Atlantic. Sound familiar at this point? These waters were of course very well traveled, but Dusty Rhodes did it in his own style, by his own rules. He didn't look like your typical wrestling star, but he was the everyman's wrestling star, and while Dusty was a part of many important things and held many prestigious titles, perhaps his most impressive title stat is 636 days as the NWA six-man tag team champion with the Road Warriors. Number 2, Hulk Hogan. Well, it had to be one of them. This list is debatable in most places, but at the top 3, I don't think there could be any argument. His high-profile image convinced Vince Jr. to give him a chance, and the rest was history. Hulkamania was born. His money drawn is hard to match. His ratings drawn are hard to match. But bell to bell, it's hard to say he could hold a candle to this man. Number 1, Ric Flair. Ric Flair was the be-all, end-all of 80s wrestling. Some will argue Hogan was a way bigger star, and those people may be right, but when it comes to everything that happened in the ring, you have to give the nod to Flair. While Hogan could make any menacing heel look like $1 million, Flair could make any white meat babyface a red-hot superstar. Flair styled and profiled his way to the top in the 1980s and never looked back. Hope you enjoyed your list. How do you think we did? Please let us know down in the comments section. Thank you very much for joining us. Please subscribe to the channel. Leave a like on your way out. We'll see you next time right here on Pro Wrestling Planet.